In a world that's loud, the church does not have to remain silent. In a world that's dark, the church can shine God's light. Welcome to Light Talks, where we dive deep into real conversations, not just echoing the world's noise, but shedding God's light on challenging topics. Let's talk.
Well, welcome back to Light Talks, everyone. Thanks for joining us here as we have real conversations with the questions and the things that are most important to you. Thank you for those of you who have submitted questions. And if you have not yet, you have a burning question you'd like us to talk about, be sure to go into the description of this podcast and click the link. We love to hear from you. And as we go through this series, these podcast episodes, we're going to try and bring a lot of the questions that you have. Sometimes we'll group the questions together and have someone as we go through a number of them. But we just want to address the things that you're thinking about, the questions maybe you have about the Bible that you haven't heard a good answer for. So thank you to all those of you who have submitted questions. And if you do have a question, or if this podcast episode makes you think of something, please go into the description and send that question in. On today's episode of Light Talks, we have a special guest here, Dr. Brandon Steenbock. Brandon.
Hey.
Thanks for coming in,
John. Yeah, glad to be here.
You and I have a little bit of history. We've known each other for a while, but for those of you for those of the people out there watching, and like, who is this Brandon guy?
Yeah.
Where did you get him off the streets? Can you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I literally came off the street.
You did.
I was walking off the street, and you guys just, as you said, John, we've known each other for a lot of years. So I serve right now at St. Mark Ministries up in Green Bay as the family minister at St. Mark, and I've been there for about 8 years. Before that, I was serving at St. Paul's in New Ulm for 11 years, New Ulm, Minnesota, the holy city in the shadow of Martin Luther College. And if you're watching and you don't have a clue where that is,
don't worry about it.
Don't worry about it.
Yep.
A small town in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota, but that's where we met at college, and so great town to live, great town to raise kids. I did raise some kids there, my wife and I. We got married actually almost 20 years ago. This summer we'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary.
Excellent.
And we have two boys that we raised there in New Ulm initially, and then finished raising them here in Green Bay. Now they're young adults. One of them's off in college already, and the other one is making college plans. So
I think everyone has one immediate question knowing you serve in Green Bay. How do you do church in Green Bay when the city basically shuts down on Sundays when there's a home game?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of exciting, actually. So we have two campuses. One is in De Pere, which is on the south side of Green Bay, and that's our big site. And actually, people generally still attend church on a Sunday morning, even when there's a home game. But if there's a noon game, we got a really nice Saturday night service attendance. And then Sunday morning, our first service, that's pretty packed.
Yes.
And everybody's trying to get home to get to the game.
Yes.
Our other campus, though, is really our original one, which is smaller. And it is literally a block from the stadium. It is just a block north of Lombardi Street on Oneida. It is in the shadow of Lambeau Field. You can literally walk out into the parking lot, look up, and look at the Jumbotron and see what the score is. So
it's a weird kind of...
It's a strange
really
place.
Cool, but yeah.
But actually what we do then is allow people to park in our parking lot for the games. And just like everybody else, everybody around there, all the houses, they let people park on their lawns. They charge them $40 to park on a lawn. And we say, hey, we'll charge you the same thing, but you can use our indoor bathrooms.
It's
kind of a nice deal, right? Some heated bathrooms, all that stuff. They can tailgate. So we try to make it part of the community is the idea there.
Yeah.
And it's a cool connection, really. And Sunday mornings can be exciting when there's a game. And, well, sadly, that's done for the season. But
it is.
We'll just have to.
That's okay.
We'll just have to look forward to next year.
Get back to normal life now.
Yeah, right.
So you said you do family ministry.
Yeah.
Like what does that entail for you?
Yeah,
in your
for
ministry?
me, I think the definition of family ministry is maybe a little bit different than you think of it. Because a lot of times we think of family ministry as children's ministry, leading the children's stuff, the youth stuff like that. But my focus is actually on creating strong households, spiritually strong households. And so I do that by doing a lot of marriage work. I counsel all of our couples who are getting married in kind of a pre-marriage counseling system. And then I also provide marriage counseling to couples who are struggling. We do a marriage retreat every year. We have a marriage class that I teach. We call it Marriage Builders, and just a lot of other resources for couples. And then I also do a lot of parenting work. So counsel parents who are coming in saying, hey, I'm struggling with this with my kid. What do I do? I also do workshops. I am a certified Love and Logic facilitator, so I also teach Love and Logic. I've taught that both at our church and at schools in the area.
Okay.
And that provides a lot of tools for parents. It's really actually common sense stuff, but sometimes it's the kind of common sense that until you hear it said by somebody standing in front of you who has a nice title, you don't think of it, right? Or you're not sure that it's right. And so that's the opportunity I have, is to help affirm parents really in understanding that, hey, this isn't as hard as all that, but you just have to be a little bit intentional.
Yeah. Well, when we were discussing this podcast episode and what we want to talk about, something really struck us in the conversation here when we were talking about this that I would love to dive into. Kind of the question that I want to approach here today is, you made a comment about how having an amazing marriage, but being okay at parenting, is so much better than having an okay marriage and being just the best parents ever. And that just kind of struck us like, ooh, that could be very applicable to a lot of the people that we hope are watching, young parents, just starting to get into marriage, get into parenting, even teenagers who haven't thought about these years, but they're not very far away for them. That just sounded like a question that we need to talk about.
Yeah.
Something we need to dive into. So we could have a whole podcast on marriage.
Yeah.
A whole 500 episodes on marriage. We could do the same thing for parenting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I think what I want to try and talk about is where those two intersect.
Sure.
And what do young parents, maybe even parents our age who have teenagers, getting to that age, what do we need to think about when it comes to our marriage and how it affects our parenting, and maybe how our parenting might also affect our marriage?
Sure.
And how those two work together. So where do you want to start?
Well, I think I'd like to maybe give a little more clarification to kind of that statement that you're saying, which is, okay, if I have so-so parenting but a great marriage, why is that better than just a so-so marriage with great parenting? And I think to a certain extent, obviously, if I could have both a great marriage and great parenting, that's going to be the best.
And that's the goal, ultimately.
Right.
Yeah.
But we're human, right? We're limited. And there's only so much energy and time that I can give to something. And so the question becomes, between focusing on my spouse and the marriage that God has given us and focusing on the children that God has put into our hands, how do I make sure that I don't sacrifice that marriage on the altar of children?
Yes.
Right? And how do I make sure that I prioritize my spouse so that they don't feel like the children have supplanted them in my heart, right? Because I think that's my biggest concern for a lot of people, that I see this happen in families. They have a loving marriage, they're excited to be together, and then the kid comes along and suddenly there's this almost like living vicariously through the child.
Yes.
And I've got to do everything I can to make this child just have the best life. And I've even had people in my office where one or the other spouse will say, well, the problem is they idolize the children. The children are the idol. I'm second place or third at best.
Yeah.
And they're frustrated, they're hurt, they're hurting, and I've seen, couples divorce over this.
Sure.
And the fact is that if parents don't prioritize each other, the negative impact of that disrupted relationship on the children is actually more powerful than the negative impact of, hey, we've got a fantastic, rock-solid marriage, but we're not the best of parents, and sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes we blow up at our kids. Sometimes we have to apologize to our kids. Like, all of those things can be mitigated by strong parenting, or by strong marriage, rather.
Sure.
But you can't mitigate a broken marriage by just having strong parenting.
Sure. So maybe let's dive into the culture a little bit. How did we get here? Like, where has this idolatry over our kids come from? Was it always that way? Why does every parent want to at least get their kids to go to Disneyland once in their lifetimes, to experience that, see the world, to make sure we travel, to make sure they're in every sport, that they at least get a chance?
Yeah.
Like, do we know where that came from, or are we just here now we got to figure out what to do?
Yeah, I mean, you could probably trace the flow of thought from kind of the early days of parenting books back with like Dr. Spock back in the 60s or 70s.
Dr. Spock.
There was this philosophy that started really. I would say that it kind of started with postmodernism a little bit, with this idea that we come into the world as a blank slate, and that as kids we are neither good nor bad, but everything is sort of coded by nurture, right?
Yeah.
And so there was this idea that like, hey, kids can be either inherently good, or they can actually just be, good or bad depending on what you do as a parent. And so if you just make them happy, make them healthy, do everything you can to really make your kids' lives special and great, then that's going to lead to children who are just really awesome and great members of society, and completely eliminated the idea that maybe there's something behind kids that, and this is kind of to speak biblically for a minute, there's a sinful nature, right? There's this aspect of us that is inherently broken and in need of redemption. And that inherent brokenness can't be fixed by just taking my kid to Disneyland.
Yeah, and all of a sudden they're better. Right. I've always loved if someone wants to understand the doctrine of original sin. The classic example is, what does your child first say? Mine or yours?
Right.
It says mine.
Yeah.
I want, we have that even as young children before we can even talk.
Right.
You can see that in a child.
And any parent of a 3-year-old knows that no 3-year-old bounces out of bed in the morning and says, "Mother, what would you like me to do for you today?
How can I serve you today, Mom?
How can I make today wonderful for you?" No 3-year-old's doing that.
No.
No, they are selfish, self-centered, looking for their own needs, and that's okay to a certain extent. From a human standpoint, they have needs, and they've got to have those needs met.
Correct.
But they also have to be taught then how to be selfless.
Yes.
And so this is the part of the problem, is that over the generations, what's happened is we've sort of taken that children are inherently blank or inherently good, and we just have to sort of endorse who they are and let them be who they are. And we've taken that to the nth degree, to the point of saying, like, we should just embrace a child getting to do whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
And to go back to the mentality that, wait, my job as a parent is to teach this young person how to be the right way, how to be selfless, how to be caring, how to be kind, how to function as an adult in the world that actually cares about other people. Like, because that's the goal, right?
Yeah, to love
That's what
others.
we want to see. And this honestly brings us back to why this topic is so important, why it's so necessary that you have a strong marriage, because that's where you actually model that stuff.
Okay.
Because if marriage is going to be built on selflessness, which it has to be, then parents who are modeling that to each other, that self-giving, that care for one another, that self-sacrifice for the good of the whole, that's when the kids are going to learn that that's how life is lived. And that's what's going to lead them to say, this is what matters. The flip side is, if you don't do that, if you just endorse the child's selfishness and then also sort of behave selfishly in your marriage, then really what you've done is you've raised a child who believes that the world is tough and I got to get on for myself, and I just need to look out for me.
Yeah.
And that doesn't lead to a better society.
Sure.
Certainly doesn't lead to more holiness in the children themselves.
And so, I mean, maybe just saying in the parenting world for a little bit, I like how you said that, is that's what we ultimately want, is for our children to become more like Jesus. It's not a good work type of a thing where that's our only goal, is for them to be good people, but to know they're forgiven, they're sinful, and they are forgiven.
Yes.
And I had a young dad recently just ask me, like, what did you do? Why are your girls so good? And I've been blessed with some great girls. So number one, God's good grace for one.
Sure.
Like, they're just good kids. But as I was thinking about that, I think, and this is more just in the parenting realm for a moment, I think back to the times when we were, my wife and I were talking about this and hearing from parenting advice to make sure that the kids know the boundaries. Because really, when they're growing up, they're testing every boundary.
Yeah.
And your job as a parent is to protect them by showing them where good boundaries are. You know, don't run in the middle of a street. That's a boundary. You got to look both ways first. And if they don't, they're going to get in trouble for their own safety.
Yeah.
But it was really one warning and then follow through with the timeout. And we live also in a parenting day, I think, where it's, I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 2.5, 2 3/4, 2 5/8,
Yeah.
2 we lose our math because we don't know how to get closer without actually following through.
Yeah.
So having some good some parenting advice and parenting, I don't know if you want to call them rules, but how to be a good parent, that is one piece of all of this.
Yeah.
So any thoughts on that?
Well, I love your example because I see this, and because I teach parenting workshops, this is the kind of stuff that I teach against. And then I go to the mall or whatever, and I see these moms doing this, and I just want to walk up and be like, Mom, let me stop you for a second. Let me tell you what you're doing. I don't do that.
Yes.
That would probably be really uncomfortable. Actually, what I've developed a habit is when I see a mom interacting with her kids, what I like to do is I just like to say, hey, Mom, you're doing an awesome job.
Yeah.
You're rocking it.
Yeah.
I don't know if she actually is or not. And I'm not trying to be
just
not
encouraging.
genuine,
Yeah.
But there's this thing that's called evocative speaking, where you're telling somebody what you want to see. And by encouraging them towards the thing you want to see, it actually brings that out of them.
Yeah.
And so that's what I'm trying to do, is just trying to kind of evoke that, hey, I can do this. I can handle this. These kids are driving me crazy, but I'm a mom. I can do this, right? So I try to say that to dads too. Hey, Dad, you're rocking it. You're doing a great job.
Yes.
Especially when I see the dad carrying the little one while Mom is checking out at Target and Dad's playing with the little one. I'm like, there you go. Be involved. Because that's part of the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
It's like being intentional. But getting back to kind of what you were saying about discipline, I mean, yeah. What do I teach my kids when I give them a timer? 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
What I've just taught them is, Mom said it, but I don't have to do anything until she gets to 3, and she might never get there.
She's never going to get there.
Because she's going to give me every integer between 2 and 3.
Yes.
So I might as well just keep going until the very last second. And then we wonder, well, why is my kid responding to this? Why isn't he more well-behaved? Because you just told him that he doesn't have to be.
Yep.
Right? Whereas if you say, I'm going to say it once, and if you don't do what I asked, then the consequence comes.
Yeah.
Well, then my kid has to learn, hey, I don't know. If I don't do what Mom says, I don't know what the consequence is going to be. So I better listen the first time. And it doesn't work perfectly every time.
No.
But setting those limits, allowing our kids to go through consequences. There's kind of a principle that I like to teach, which is to parent like God parents. Which is, God loves us unconditionally, but he doesn't spare us from all of the consequences of our choices.
Correct.
He spares us from the ultimate consequence that we could not handle, right?
Yes.
The ultimate consequence being that my sinful actions would take me to hell, and he took that away so that I don't have to suffer it. That is like the ultimate grace, that he would say, I'm going to stop that consequence from coming into your life. But I'm not going to stop every other consequence, because I want to teach you how to actually live life. And so if I lie, God lets people trust me less.
Yeah.
He doesn't just sort of blank people's minds that, oh, no, don't worry about it. People will still trust you. Like, no, people will trust me less, right? If I go speeding down the highway every time I drive, I might eventually get pulled over, and I might get a speeding ticket. And I could lament and be like, God, why did you let me get a speeding ticket?
Yeah.
Or I could just be like, well, I broke the law.
Yeah.
That's my
Save
choice.
me from an accident or
But
hurting someone.
God chose to give me that so that I would learn, hey, maybe don't be such a reckless idiot, because people's lives could be at stake here. Right? So he's teaching me how to be somebody who is caring to others.
Yeah.
And so if I can do that with my own kids then, right? And I like to use the example of this. When we were living in Minnesota, our house was on a hill. We had this great sidewalk, and the kids could get on their little bikes or scooters or whatever, and they could go just like pelting down the sidewalk, which was awesome. And at the bottom of that was kind of our little patch of lawn, and they could sort of like spill out into the lawn and just crash there if they wanted to.
Yeah.
The problem was that if they kept going straight, they would go right out into the street, and that was a busy street right in front of us. And so what did I have to do as a parent? Well, I had to make sure they didn't go out in the street, because that would have been potentially, life-threatening for them, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to stop them from going down the hill as long as I can teach them, hey, if you're going to crash in the grass. And there were some skinned knees and some tears.
Yep.
And we had a son who was very convinced that a Band-Aid made it worse. I don't know why, but he just was convinced.
Because you have to pull it off at some point.
Well, right. I think he thought that if the Band-Aid has to go on, it must be a worse injury than if it didn't.
Yeah.
But he got some skinned knees. And what did he learn? Well, he learned then that, hey, you go too fast, you could crash. And what did that translate to? When he got his driver's license, man, he was the safest driver you ever met. He wasn't one of these dumb teenagers who's driving way too fast, putting other people's lives at risk.
Yeah.
He had to learn that. at a young age. So it was affordable consequence, right? I can make this mistake now and it's okay. And then later on, I won't make the same mistake when it's much bigger possible consequence.
Because as you get older, the consequences get bigger.
Right.
Bigger. And then what I might add to that too is when it comes to discipline, something we always were taught and always did was when the timeout is done, I love you, and you say the words to your kid, I forgive you, I love you, I would like a hug, and then go play.
Gosh, I love that. I love that. I love that I forgive you.
Saying those words
is so powerful. Because like if I were to say I'm sorry, John, to you for something I did, your normal instinct would be it's okay.
Yeah, it's all right. Okay,
but it's not okay because that's why I'm asking for forgiveness.
Yeah.
So to say I forgive you is so much more powerful.
Yeah.
I love that.
Something also that can translate over into the marriage side as well.
Yeah.
So let's go back over to that. You had started to talk a little bit about that dynamic. So marriage side, how does that? Maybe let's dive a little deeper into how that does affect the kids.
Sure.
And then what do we want to do? What do we want to say over on the marriage side?
Yeah.
And how it works together.
Sure. Well, first of all, to talk about why is it so important that you have this stable marriage. There's been a lot of good research lately. There was a book just this last year that came out, Melissa Kearney, who's an economist, and she is by no means, she wouldn't call herself a Christian. She wouldn't call herself a traditionalist in any way, but she came out with a book called The Two-Parent Privilege. And what she does is she actually collates a lot of data about the fact that when you have a child raised by their biological parents who are in the same household, loving each other and loving the kids, that leads to the best outcomes. The opposite, what you see is for kids who grew up in, maybe it's a household of divorce or a single parent, they have much higher rates of risky behavior when they're young, especially like drugs and sex and stuff like that. They're much less likely to perform well in school. They're much less likely to perform well in a job. They're much more likely to end up committing crimes, being incarcerated, that sort of thing. And especially for young men who grow into adulthood without both parents raising them, especially without a dad present. Young men have much higher rates of we'll just call it antisocial behavior, and much more likelihood of getting themselves into trouble. They usually tend to have lower incomes. So there's from a societal perspective, there's all kinds of things that are happening there, right? But let's even look at it from a spiritual perspective. There was this big study that often gets cited. It was back in the 90s, and it was in Switzerland, where they did a study on kids attending church with their parents and what leads to them as adults continuing to go to church. And what they found was really kind of startling in a sense, because they found that if mom only goes to church and the kids, if the kids are just going with mom, then their likelihood that they keep going to church is like 7%. It's like super low. And if they go with mom and dad, it's something like 56%. So it's a huge jump up, right? But here was the weird thing, was if they only went with dad, it was like 79%.
Really?
And they're like, what is going on with that?
Only dad, not mom?
Right.
And it got
I was
higher.
like, what happened there?
Interesting.
Well, when they dug a little deeper, what they found was that you kind of have to sort the data, because of the group where they were going with mom and dad, a portion of them were going because mom was making sure that they were all going. Mom was the one driving it. Mom was the one making sure dad got to church. And the kids knew it. And then there was a portion where dad was the one who was driving the train there, and dad was the one making sure the whole family, mom, kids included. And when they looked at that, it was like the rate of kids, just took that set, the rate of kids sticking with church jumped up into the 90s.
Wow.
And they've duplicated that study over the years. Every 5 to 7 years, somebody does another study on the same vein, and they keep finding the same results. So it turns out that when mom and dad are both committed to each other and committed to their faith, and they're working with their kids in that area, like those kids grow up to be faithful. And so one researcher, Christian Smith, he's at Yale, he said he did some work on this, and he found that the number one predictor that kids will grow up to be faithful is if they talked about faith at home with both their parents.
Talked about faith, not just going to church.
Right.
Talked about faith.
If it was a part of their daily conversations or weekly conversations if it was something that was part of the culture of their home.
Isn't that in Scripture anyway? Talk about the Old
Deuteronomy
Testament.
6,
Yes, talk
right.
about this on the road and when you get up and when you lie down.
Exactly. I mean, God's saying right there, he's saying, talk about it all the time.
Yeah.
At home and when you're out of the house, in the morning and the evening, and make it part of everything you think and everything you do. And that's what the whole tied as a symbol on your head and on your hands is really trying to say. It's saying, make it the things you think and make it the things you do. And it turns out 3,500 years ago, God knew exactly what he was talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing because he designed it.
Yeah. It's
Family,
This is what's funny to me is like when you do all this research, what you find out is that God's design works.
Yes. Yeah.
It's
just
not
does.
really a surprise.
It does.
But it's about being intentional.
Sure.
Yeah.
So I heard one very practical piece of advice. Talk about God
Yeah.
in the family.
Yeah.
And
Which is practical not just for parenting, but for your marriage
as well.
Because
Yes.
if you want to be connected as a husband and wife,
yes.
one of the best ways to do that is to talk about the deepest stuff.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, our faith shouldn't just be, my faith doesn't exist in a vacuum. My wife's faith doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Yeah.
We have to talk about these things. And it doesn't necessarily mean that I have to turn it into a program, right? I mean,
Yes.
sometimes we kind of get into this, like, I've got to have a book, and we got to go through this devotional book, and we got to do this devotion every day. And a lot of times, I mean, if you can do that, great.
Yes.
That's amazing.
Yes.
And some people have that discipline. Others will say, it's really hard for me to keep up with that. Okay.
Yeah.
But then talk about it in other ways.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that you read a book and I read a book and we talk about that book a few times a week or
Yeah.
whatever. But it's less about what you do and whether or not you do it.
And even if you go to church together, talk about the sermon. What were
Yeah.
your big takeaways?
Yeah.
What really struck you? Why did it strike you? Those types of conversations. So, leaning a little bit more into that marriage piece, what are some things that you would want to tell parents, young parents, maybe that they're not thinking about?
Sure.
Maybe that would make a lot of sense, or what are some practical steps, or what should they be thinking about when they're, because they really want, like what you said, we want everyone to grow in their faith.
Yeah.
Husbands, wives, children. Let's talk to the dads first. As the spiritual leaders,
Yeah.
what do you want to tell dads to
Yeah.
think? What do you want them to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, you use the term spiritual leaders, and I think that there's a lot of good research to show that, I mean, men seem to be kind of inherently wired for leadership. And I know that's not always popular to say, because there are women who are great leaders.
Absolutely.
Not downplaying that at all. But it's just that the things that are needed for leadership tend to go more in the direction of men. You look at like kind of a side example, but the Strengths Finder, Clifton Strengths.
Yep.
When you actually look at the data on which strengths skew more towards men and which strengths skew more towards women, it turns out that things like achiever and maximizer and the things that you want to have in a leader, strategic strengths, tend to skew more towards men. And that the more kind of personal empathy and caregiving and developer and the things that have more to do with kind of bringing people up tend to skew more towards women. So for men, you do have this kind of inherent built-in strength for leading. And there's some good research on how your brain works that says that you are built and wired for focus. So use that, right? Lean into it. One of the things that I think men need to understand, especially about themselves, though, is that whether this is a malfunction of the way that sin has messed us up, or if it's related in some way to these strengths we have that's just been twisted, I don't know. But the biggest fear a man has is embarrassment, shame, to feel shame, right? To be seen as a failure, to be seen as messing up. And what happens in our relationship with our wives a lot of times is that she exposes that, right? We become vulnerable. She maybe points out where we've not done something. My wife asked me to get something done and then I don't do it. And then she goes, well, why didn't you do this? And immediately I have this shame response.
Yeah.
And that shame response can lead me to want to flee or to fight.
Yeah.
And neither of those is good for the marriage, right? And so to guys, I would want to say, like, when you feel that, like, I understand it. It's hard. It sucks. It doesn't feel good to have this like embarrassment going on. But lean into the discomfort for a moment Like, you're being given an opportunity to do a hard thing. Doing hard things is good for you. And when you lean into that discomfort and walk through it, what you find is that your wife is not trying to shame you at all. She's trying to connect with you.
Okay.
Because women's biggest fear is disconnection, to have
Yes.
a relationship break. And what women do with each other is, in their relationships, they say, I'm worried about this. And their response from another woman is, let me connect with you. Let me show you how you don't have to be worried, right? And so she's exposing this to say to her husband, I want you to know what I'm afraid of. So you forgot to take out the garbage. But what I'm really afraid of is that you just aren't listening to me at all. And so I'm telling you that you forgot to take out the garbage, but underneath that is the fear that you just aren't listening. And when he gets angry, when he fights, when he runs away, her deepest fear is being realized. Oh, he's going to break this connection with me.
Sure.
And so maybe she pursues, which only makes him more ashamed.
Yeah.
Or maybe she closes in, or she turns elsewhere.
Yeah.
Either way, it's hard on the marriage, right?
Yeah.
So he needs to know that by leaning into that, it actually meets that fear with the opposite, with assurance. I'm not disconnecting from you. I'm hearing you, I'm listening to you, and I'm going to try to do better for you.
Yeah.
And so do that, guys, do that. And then accept that call to lead, like that whole idea of, be a leader. I like to put it this way to young men, you first. Like, if there's a problem in your relationship that needs to be addressed, who needs to move first? You do.
Yes. Yep.
If there's something that needs to change for the better of the whole family and somebody needs to make a decision, you do. I'm not saying that your wife shouldn't come along with you on that.
Yeah.
If I was talking to her, I'm going to say different things to her, right?
Yeah.
But for the guy, I'm going to say you first. That's leadership.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes me think of two things. One, it's always interesting in Scripture to me where we're told how husbands and wives are told to submit to each other out of reverence for Christ. The wives are specifically asked to submit to their husbands. But the husbands, what are they asked to do?
Love as Christ loves.
Which means die.
Yeah.
Basically,
yes, it does.
You're putting your life on the line. You're going to die for this woman, so Christ has called us to be like him and be willing to sacrifice ourselves.
Yeah.
So as men, we're the first sacrificers.
Yeah.
And
I want to take that a step further, though, because when you read that passage, that's Ephesians 5, right? And Paul says, love as Christ loved, who gave himself up for the church. But then he starts talking about, he says, and washing her with the water to make her clean, all this stuff. It sounds a lot less like dying and a lot more like baptism.
Yes.
Which happens over and over and over again. Every time we bring a baby to the fountain and we baptize that baby. Every time a young person says, I'm in with Christ, what do I do? And we say, repent and be baptized, and we baptize them. Every time an old man says, I've pushed this away for years, but I'm done pushing it away, and they come and they bend their head over, Christ is present there. And he's living for us. Because that's the thing. Jesus died for us, but he also rose for us.
Yeah.
It also says that he is always interceding for us. So everything Christ is doing is always for the good of his church. So I like to put it this way. John, you would take a bullet for your wife?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
What if you had to hand wash the dishes every single day for the rest of your life because it would make your wife happy?
Brandon, that sounds so hard.
Right?
Yeah.
Like to lay down your life every single day.
Every day, yeah.
Right? I said that one time at a pre-marriage seminar, and one guy raised his hand, and I said, yeah, and he says, can I just have the bullet now, or? Because it's hard, right? Yeah, it's easy. It's like, it feels bold and awesome to be like, I would die for her.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, live for her every day, man.
Every day, yeah.
Every day.
Which means you have to give up what you want sometimes.
Yeah.
And that was the marriage commitment. And one thing, too, a young dad asked me, I want to get to the ladies here, too, but one thing a dad asked me about the parenting piece, and my mind immediately went to, I want my kids to see just how much I love their mom.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to show affection. I'm going to give her hugs, and I'm going to do those things in front of my kids, which I didn't get a lot of when I was growing up.
Sure.
But that was always important to me. Just real briefly, do you have anything to say on that effect?
Oh, yeah.
For what should dads be thinking about as far as not only just loving their wives, but how it's impacting the kids.
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't you raised girls, I raised boys, and it's a little bit different.
It probably, yes. Yeah.
Boys and girls are different.
Yes.
Boys and girls are different.
They're different, yes. Believe it or not.
No, it's countercultural to say, but they really are.
Yes.
Turns out. So, as I was raising my boys, I wanted them to know that part of manhood is being fiercely devoted to the woman that God has given you. Mm-hmm. And so one of the ways that I manifested that for them was that when they had a conflict with their mom, I might talk with them about it and say, well, here's where I think, I get what you're saying. I get how you're feeling. I try to be empathetic and stuff like that and listen to them. But I would also say, but here's where your mom is right. And one of the other things, though, that I would often do is if they came into sharp conflict and were yelling or screaming at their mom, mm-hmm. I would often say, hey, you don't talk to my wife that way.
Oh, okay. So you changed the verbiage.
I changed the verbiage.
Okay.
Because I wanted to impress on them that, yeah, she's your mom, and I need to teach you about respect for your mother, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But first and foremost, if you're going to be aggressive towards the woman that God has given to me, I'm her fiercest protector, and you're not up against her anymore. You're up against her husband. And that's teaching them that down the road, too, like, you got to be that for your wife. And you should expect that from every man who's married to a woman, that he's going to defend his wife. And so there's a difference to the relationship now.
Yeah.
Right? So it created a boundary. My wife and I knew we were winning when one time our son was really angry at her about something. And she said, well, talk to Dad about it then. And his response was, no, I'm not going to talk to Dad. He always takes your side.
Yep.
My wife was like, we win.
Cha-ching. I'm going to try that. Don't talk to my wife that way.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And I don't know, once again, I didn't raise girls, so
that's what I'm wondering.
if that would resonate differently
with the girls,
for a girl.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's a whole different dynamic you have going on there when you're raising girls, and this is maybe a little bit of a side issue, but it's actually it relates both to marriage and parenting.
Yeah.
Like for you as a dad, you set the standard for your girls of how a man ought to treat them.
That is the main thing I think about.
Right, and this is why I often tell dads, hey, date your daughters, take them on dates, show them this just incredible amount of love and respect that has no expectations. Right? Because then when she goes out on a date with a guy who has expectations that we as parents don't want her to give into, she's going to know right away this isn't right.
Yeah.
She may not even be able to put her finger on it, but she's going to say, no, I'm not okay with this.
Yeah.
Because she knows what it feels like to be protected, loved, cared for without those expectations.
Sure. That's something I want to do better. I'm not a great dater of my daughters, but
it's never too late. It's never too late to start.
Especially as they get in their teenage years. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
With the few minutes we have left, I do want to jump over to the ladies. We're two guys.
Yeah.
But what would you have to say to the moms, the wives, in the last couple minutes here that they should be thinking about when it comes to this issue?
Yeah. I think first, you brought up this passage before, the Ephesians passage, where it asks wives to submit to their husbands as to Christ. And I think that's a really challenging passage. I think a lot of women really struggle with that. You even mentioned the passage before that says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to say, I'm going to pick on the theology for a second there. I don't think that passage is speaking to husbands and wives at all. I think that particular line, submit to each other out of reverence for Christ, is on the tail end of here's how you as Christians relate to each other.
Christian to Christian.
And so this is just Christian to Christian. But then he gets very specific about Christian households and says, hey, by the way, wives, you're to submit to your husbands. And that feels uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But this is the way that I like to think about it. If you're a wife listening to this, here's my question. Do you have a problem submitting to Jesus? Now, if you do, that's a different conversation then.
Yeah.
Right? We need to have a conversation about that before we talk about submitting to your husband. You can't submit to your husband as you do to Christ if you don't submit to Christ at all.
Yeah.
Right? So we'd have to have that conversation first. But most of the time when I'm counseling a couple and I ask the woman, do you have a problem submitting to Christ? She said, well, of course not. I say, okay, so you don't have a problem with submission. The word submission isn't the issue here.
Yeah.
The word husband is. Because you're looking at him and you're saying, how do I submit to him?
Yeah.
It's a matter of trust, right?
Yeah.
And so what you're really saying is, I'm not sure I can trust a sinful human being to come through for me the way that Jesus will. And so what I want to say to you as a wife, if that's you, if you're feeling that, you're like, yeah, that's where I'm struggling. Jesus is asking you to do this. Do you think he's going to hang you out in the cold for that? Jesus is actually saying, I want you to trust me so much that you'll trust him even if you don't understand how.
And even if
or if you're not sure you can. Because Jesus is saying it's good for you in your marriage. Just trust me on that. So submit to Jesus, and in so doing, submit to your husband. Now, the other thing that's important about submission is to recognize that it's actually like a cooperation. It's like going into a dance. It's like having a ball. Have you guys ever gone ballroom dancing?
We did take lessons a long time ago.
Yeah.
Once.
So my wife and I did one time.
Yeah.
We were taking these lessons, and we were really struggling, and we couldn't figure out how to get the dance going. And the instructor came over, and he kind of pointed out that I wasn't doing a great job of leading, and she wasn't doing a great job of following. And he was like, hey, you need to stop trying to lead, saying to her. And then he's like, and you need to lead more confidently, saying to me. And then once we got that, it was okay. Once she was able to follow, once I was able to lead, then it looked good, right?
Yeah.
But if you think about it this way, like imagine watching Dancing with the Stars, and you see the guy and the girl, and they're dancing. Who are your eyes on? Who looks awesome?
Yeah.
It's the girl,
The
right?
girl does, yeah.
But she's not the one leading.
Yeah.
It's the guy who's leading. His love, his leadership makes her look better. Her following is what makes her look amazing.
Yeah.
And so wives, if you're struggling with this idea, trust Jesus, trust that it's good for you. And when you cooperate, lovingly cooperate with your husband, it's not about being a doormat. Okay, it's not about being stepped all over. It's not about doing things that you shouldn't do.
Yeah.
Because you got to submit to Jesus first. It's about lovingly cooperating with your husband's loving leadership. The result is beautiful. Yeah. So that's one thing I want to say to wives. Another thing I want to say to wives is your husband's going to connect with you in a way that's different than the way that you think to connect. Once again, going back to that whole thing, like when a woman and a woman connect to each other as friends, there's one thing that happens, right? They resonate. When a husband wants to connect to his wife, he does it differently. And she might think, well, that doesn't feel like connection to me. She's got to learn how to see that happen.
Yeah.
Right? So one of the ways that he connects is by shoulder-to-shoulder activity. Go out golfing if he likes to golf,
do things,
or enter into his world. If he's the kind of guy who's like, I love to play board games, play board games with him, right? If he's working out in the garage all the time, come out there and hang out with him and help. Maybe hand him the tools or whatever. If he likes to cook, be his sous chef. Whatever the case, be alongside him, a recreational companion. That's how he connects, and we can't ignore the fact that guys connect through physical intimacy. And the fact is that a lot of times wives, that goes cyclically for them, their desire and interest in that, right? And so they have to realize, like, it doesn't go as cyclically for him. It's not the same.
Sure.
But he feels more connected. Wives want to connect that way when they feel connected. Husbands want to feel connected by connecting that way.
Yeah.
So it's just two very different dynamics. And so you've got to be patient with that. And you got to be willing to enter into that and to affirm.
Yeah.
If a man's deepest fear is to be ashamed, there's a need for affirmation. I'm not talking about empty praise. I'm not being like, you're such a good husband, even if he's not being. You don't have to simper to him.
Yeah.
What you do need to do, though, is to recognize where he is strong and affirm that regularly. So that then when you have to say, hey, this didn't go so well, he already knows you're there in his corner, and he's not worried about that.
Yeah. The husband and the wife. How can I serve my person?
Yeah.
How can I make their day better?
Yeah.
How can I support them? It's not going to be easy. It means I got to set myself aside to do that. If the husband serves his wife, however that looks, if the wife serves her husband, however that looks, and the kids see that happening, you got a winning combination.
Yeah, good stuff can happen.
Not easy.
Right.
Not easy.
Let me give you just a couple of practical thoughts for how to do that. So if I can, for just a second, I want to ask you a question, your understanding of this.
Okay.
All right. So imagine you have a couple who fights like 3 days a week. They're constantly at each other versus a couple that fights maybe just about once a month. If you were to sort of judge which one is likely to stick together, which one's likely to get a divorce, which would you say?
I think the answer that most people would say is, well, the one who fights less.
Sure.
But I think I know where you're going. If you are fighting and it's healthy fighting, you're working towards the same goal and getting on the same page.
Yeah. Well, it's a trick question.
Healthy conflict.
It's a trick question because neither one, actually. based on all the research, the amount of conflict that exists is not necessarily an indicator of how healthy they are. It's about how they fight.
How they fight.
It's about what they do with those fights. But it's also about what they do after that. So one of the key factors for couples to stick together is what's called repair, or to put it in Christian terms, forgiveness.
Forgiveness, yep.
It's the ability to ask forgiveness and to give forgiveness. And that gets back to kind of something we were saying earlier. Saying those words, I forgive you, but also asking the question. Like, think about it this way. If I say I'm sorry to you for something, I can say, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry.
Right. I said the words.
Yeah.
Right. But if I ask you, hey, John, I'm sorry. I need you to forgive me.
Yes.
Like, that's so much more powerful, right? Because I'm putting my need in your hands.
Correct.
And so learning how to forgive well, that's a big thing.
Yeah.
Another practical tip, take a walk.
Just get out.
As a couple, take a walk.
Yeah.
You can plunk your kids in front of Bluey or whatever for 20 minutes and just go around the block. If you got real little kids. As your kids get a little older, a little more independent, just take a walk. My wife and I were going through a really tough time at one point, a dozen years ago or so, and we just didn't know what to do. And we talked to the district pastor, who kind of was our counselor at the time, and he said, well, just go for a walk every day. And we're like, but we got little kids at home. He's like, will they be okay for 15, 20 minutes looking at a show? We're like, I guess. My wife is like, oh, but I don't want the TV to babysit them.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's okay.
It's okay. It's all right.
He was like, it's okay for them to do this. So we put them in front of a TV and went for a walk around the block, and it made a difference.
It makes a huge difference.
It made such a huge difference for us to connect that way for 20 minutes a day. It was just such a huge blessing to us as a couple.
Yeah.
So taking a walk together, just make that a priority. It gives you that time to be with each other.
And I think there's a great place to wrap things up back to when we talked about forgiveness with the kids, sitting the kid down and say, I forgive you.
Yeah.
Have them say, I'm sorry. In your marriage, say those words, I'm sorry. Both of you, I'm sorry.
Please
you might have to
forgive
practice.
me.
Please forgive me. And to my wife's credit, she has always been really good about that. She's like, I need to hear it.
Yeah.
And I'd be like, no, I'm not going to say I forgive you. And I'm mad.
Yeah.
And she would say, she'd grab my face. I need to hear the words, I forgive you. Thank you.
Wow.
To her credit, she's
very firm on that.
She's firm on that.
That's very good.
And that's made a huge difference. So forgiveness, like Jesus, is a great place to wrap things up today.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, that's what the Bible tells us. Forgive as Christ
forgave you. That means our marriage and our kids too.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
We could talk for hours and hours, and maybe we'll have you back. So if you really like to hear from Dr. Brandon Steenbock, write a comment in the description if you're watching this on YouTube. Let us know what you think. So thank you so much for being here on our episode at the Light Talks.
Yeah, I was glad to be here.
Thanks.